So for this FlatironsTuning tech tip, we're going to talk about air oil separators versus a catch can and what is the difference. Because they're actually very similar, but depending on the application, one might make a lot more sense than the other for you. So when we're talking an air oil separator versus a catch can, the first thing to understand is what is a PCV system, because that is what they are working in. And PCV stands for positive crankcase ventilation. So the piece that you have to understand is that there is actually pressure that builds up in your crankcase, and that is from a couple things. One is from the oil as it gets hot, it can let off oil vapor in the oil pan or in the internals of the engine. And also with the crankcase, your piston rings are never going to seal 100%. So there's something called blow-by or combustion pressure that sneaks past the rings and into the crankcase. If you didn't have some way to vent that pressure, it would basically blow off valve cover seals or various other seals through the engine. So what they realized, way back when developing engines is that, especially on turbocharged engines, because you have a lot higher cylinder pressures than with a naturally aspirated car, you need a way to vent that pressure. Now, you can't vent it to atmosphere. That's not allowed, basically, unless it's a 100% off-road race car. So if you're going to vent that pressure, it has to go back into the engine somehow, and that is done by basically routing back into the inlet, the air intake system of the car. So that's what you're doing with a catch can and an air oil separator. They both actually serve that same function. So what is the difference? Well, a catch can, simply put, is simpler. So here's a very basic example of a Cusco catch can. Basically just has an in and an out, and it's literally a can. There doesn't necessarily have to be anything in it. It can literally just be an open can. And so the idea is that if you have this vent that's coming from your crankcase or your valve cover, and you put it on the inlet, then it has to move through a couple hard bends. Then it changes pressure as it goes from this small volume to this large volume, and then it is compressed again through a small volume. That will cause oil vapor and stuff to drop out of that air, and then on the outlet that goes straight into your inlet. So on a Subaru, it would go into your turbo inlet hose. That's where the factory PCV goes into. So that is a positive vent, because you're actually, when you're under boost, you're actually pulling vacuum through your turbo inlet. So you're actually actively pulling pressure out of the crankcase and out the cylinder heads. You're actively moving that oil vapor and such out of your crankcase and your cylinder heads. You can certainly have a catch can that is a little bit more elaborate than just a simple can. So the example of that I can show you is this one. This is a Mishimoto catch can, actually for a BMW N54 engine. It is still a simple can, so whatever is caught will be collected in the can, but there are a couple of filter elements to prevent anything that is caught from going back into the inlet of the engine. So what then is an air oil separator? Well, it is basically exactly the same as a catch can, but it has a lot more pieces to it. So you can see on a race car, here we actually have the competition IAG air oil separator. This is a street air oil separator. The biggest difference is twofold. One is an air oil separator has a lot more baffles and whatnot in the body of it to prevent or to fully separate any oil and oil vapor from the air before it goes back into the inlet. So whatever is pulled in is only going to be air. There's not going to be any oil vapor. And then the other part of it is this has a return. So there's actually one of these outlets that actually if ever any liquid oil might be caught in this can, will actually be put back into the engine. Whereas both of the catch cans are just sealed units. So whatever you catch, it just sits in here. The other thing that we'll talk about with air oil separators is most of them now incorporate coolant passages, but we'll come back to that. So why do you need this? Well, either one of these, the Air Oil Separator or catch can, is going to prevent any of that oil vapor or potentially even liquid oil from getting pulled in through the inlet and being burned. So that reduces carbon deposits for sure in the engine. Oil vapor, if it's prevalent enough, can actually reduce octane of the fuel, so it can actually be more prone to detonation. So that's why you would want to do something like this, to basically make sure that if you are venting this pressure, the air that's going back into the engine is just air and you're not transferring any oil or anything else. Basically, what I could say is if it is just more of a street car, low boost, closer to factory boost levels, that sort of thing, catch can is almost always going to be adequate. So if it's a race car, if you're running higher boost, much bigger turbo than stock, the higher the boost pressure, that's where something like an Air-Oil Separator is much more of an advantage. Part of the reason for that is that another advantage to the Air-Oil Separator is the oil return. Catch cans, something small like this, you're going to want to check this periodically. Maybe every time you get an oil change, maybe once a month, once every 3 months, to see what you've got in here. If you've collected a certain amount of oil, like if you fill this up, that vacuum is now going to be pulling that liquid oil in, and that's a problem. You need to empty this periodically, or at very minimum check it, which is why, like this Cusco, for instance, has this clear tube, so you can see what the level is. If this tube shows that you're halfway up, you need to take this off and empty it so that you don't pull in liquid oil. The Air Oil Separators won't do that. I mentioned coolant with the Air Oil Separators. Why do they run coolant through it? Well, because people figured out with Air Oil Separators, especially if you're running E85 as a fuel, that the PCV oil that's caught has a lot more tendency to kind of froth up or even kind of foam up or almost gel. And that's partially because of the alcohol that's present and how the alcohol interacts with oil sometimes. So they run coolant through the Air Oil Separator to heat everything up to engine temperature, so if you have any of that foam or froth or whatever you want to call it, it melts and then it'll go back into the engine. So you're not holding some kind of volume here that you're now running short of in the engine bay. So that's why, especially if you're running 85, an Air Oil Separator that runs coolant through it is a lot more advantageous than just a catch can. Because if you have a lot of that debris, especially a small catch can like this, it'll fill up very quickly. The other thing too is expense. Catch cans are very simple. You're basically, in the simplest form, picking one of the main lines of the PCV system and just teeing into it, in and out, and that's it. The Air Oil Separators, there's a lot more involved. They're much more comprehensive. Any of the good ones, and I would say probably at this point, IAG is one of our favorites out there, but there's certainly others. They pretty much will comprehensively tap into the PCV system and ensure that none of the vents are now going directly to the inlet. They're all being captured in the can before it goes back into the inlet. So it's more comprehensive, but they're also a lot more expensive. Air Oil Separators, $300–400 is the price range you're looking at. Catch can be in the $100 range or just a little bit over there. And I will say, if it's a low boost engine, mainly street driven engine, if it's a healthy engine, really all that you should ever have is more or less a film of oil. Like, you really shouldn't, in a catch can, it should take a long time even to fill this up with a healthy engine. If you put on a catch can and you fill it up quickly, say within a couple tanks of fuel, or especially if, so for instance, like a 20-minute track session, that could be indicative of some other issue with the engine and its well-being. But certainly if you put on a catch can and fill it up quickly, then having something like an Air Oil Separator, where you have a return that drains back into the engine, would be a lot more advantageous, even though it costs more. So basically, they do the same function. The Air Oil Separator is just a little bit more comprehensive, and you never really have to check this. Once it's good, it will drain the oil back in. So that's the difference between the two. But ultimately, the thing to remember is that they do perform the same function. And again, any of the street ones, you want to make sure it routes back into the inlet, so that you're actually getting a positive pressure ventilation. I hope that helps. we get a lot of questions about the difference, so hopefully that helps you. If it did, please drop a like and stay tuned for more Flatirons Tuning tech tips.